it's time, 3 o'clock here. If you weren't in the previous session, I don't know if all of you were. Again, I'm studying these four men in the sessions because of their importance by other historians mentioned John Clark, Roger Williams, Isaac Backus, and John Leland as very important in the church-state, the development of the proper idea of the church-state relationship in America, and they contributed powerfully to the rise of religious toleration freedom. And another writer said that democratic America should be eternally grateful to the Baptists of colonial New England and Virginia, for it was, at least in part, their struggle for religious liberty which culminated victoriously in the omission of any religious test or restriction when the Constitution of the United States was being framed. That's Article 6 of the United States Constitution. You don't have to join a particular church, or you don't have to agree to the dogma of any particular church. And some of you, if you know much about history, the preachers over in England that had really gotten saved and they were preaching the gospel, and they were being forced to conduct their services by the common book of prayer, and they rejected that. And of course, what that resulted in was that we got a lot of great preachers in America that way, because they left England. So on Leland, got to get over there. Let's start with, I've got an assessment here of Leland. That's on the back of the page about John Leland's sermon in the Capitol. And Robert G. Torbett, who wrote a history of the Baptists back in 1965, said, "The leading Baptist spokesman in behalf of religious freedom was John Leland of Culpeper County, a minister in whose church Thomas Jefferson is said to have worshipped on occasion, and with whom Leland enjoyed friendship." Now, Jefferson never joined any church, but understand he attended a lot of services, and we'll talk about one particular place that he was often in church in just a minute. Again, Leland was a Jeffersonian Republican and later became a follower of Andrew Jackson. In a series of political essays, he set forth his views on government, which were to the effect that the Republican form is the best preservative of the good of society, and that all power is vested in and consequently derived from the people. The consent of the governed, as it's in the Declaration of Independence. All power is vested in and consequently derived from the people, and that laws made by legislatures which are inconsistent with the Constitution are not binding. He also insisted that legislators have no right to alter that compact, and that a man is not obligated to surrender his conscience to the state. And this was part of the argument just recently about even mandates in this country of taking vaccines and stuff, The people said, this is against my conscience, And so it's very up to date in that respect. To Leland, that government is best which rules least, and I really like Leland in this regard. That which is economical, instead of having a $30 trillion debt, which maintains a favorable balance of trade, which sponsors soil improvement. He was an agrarian, he thought that was a great part of America. You got to be able to feed yourself, and which affords broad educational opportunities for its citizens. And again, I'll mention here, if any of the things I mentioned, if you would like to have the PDF file, Adobe file, on your computer, just write to my email address there, and I'll do what I can to take care of things. All the papers on these different individuals were actually done in color, so the images and stuff look a lot better on your computer than they do on the grayscale that I printed out. Now, I wanted to mention the importance of John Leland, that he was definitely a friend of George Mason, one of the great constitutional architects of Virginia and somebody that stood for freedom, and also Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. He met with these people. They knew him. When Jefferson was governor down there, he was beset sometimes with John Leland getting petitions signed by the Baptists all over Virginia, and then dropping these in the governor's lap or the legislature's lap, and asking them to do something that the people wanted taken care of. So they heard from him quite often about these things. But as I put here, John Leland's sermon in the Capitol. This is actually quoted right out of this Stokes Church and State in the United States. That's a 3-volume set, a tremendous book, written by an Episcopalian, but a lot of wonderful information can be found in there, and all kinds of pictures in there with captions that are very important about things all over this country and events that happen. It's worth just paging through and reading the captions. But the House of Representatives, early in its history, authorized the use of its hall for religious service. So think about that. The people that actually wrote the First Amendment and approved it saw nothing wrong with using a public building for religious services. Now, they would not have allowed that to just be used for one group, in favor of one. But as it explains here, when they went to Washington, there was nothing there. The churches didn't have buildings. And so they thought it was important to worship God. And so they chose chaplains, and the chaplains of the United States Capitol for the Congress, the House and the Senate, whatever visiting preacher was in town, they would have him preach. And it was not only for the Congress, the whole town. People came. It was a public event to go to church in Washington. And the place that they had usually they were using what is now Statuary Hall, okay, where all the big beautiful room in the Capitol. But there were times that you can find that they were also using both the House and the Senate and the chamber of the United States Supreme Court was also being used for religious services, and that was in the Capitol too. That is the room that today, wherever they're going to have a big show hearing, there's this big long desk where, like, United States senators will sit as they're questioning people. Well, that's where the Supreme Court used to sit before the Supreme Court had a building, okay? The Supreme Court room was being used for church services on Sunday because why not? The building was there and people needed a place to meet. And John Quincy Adams tells that in his life, when he was in Washington, and he was over in a number of foreign countries doing things before he became president and stuff, but when he was in Washington, he went to church at the Department of the Treasury in that building. So there were churches services, I know, in 4 different government buildings. How in the world today can the United States Supreme Court tell a football coach in Texas if he wants to pray on the 50-yard line because it's public property, Separation of Church says he can't pray there? This is nuts. These people do not understand what an establishment of religion was. When you had an established religion, it was costing other people money. It involved actually material things, that you were taking money away from other people or giving money to people to benefit them over other religious groups, the different Christian denominations, especially back at the time we're talking about the founding of the country. They were not going to favor any one group, but they were not going to prohibit the free exercise. And so the fact that they had church at the House, and they had church at the Senate, and they had religious services in the Supreme Court and the Department of the Treasury, that was the free exercise of religion as far as they were concerned. So we're all mixed up today, okay, and they don't know their history. People don't know their history about this, so that's partly why I want to print this out. During the administration, Thomas Jefferson, who was president from 1801 to 1809, The Capitol was used for religious services. These were generally held in the main hall of the old Senate wing, where both houses met prior to the completion in 1804 of the House wing. Well, we are told that the president himself frequently attended. He would get on his, all this security and everything. He loved to ride horses. He would just simply get on his horse and ride over to the Capitol for church. And he even did it in the rain, okay? There's an account. James Hudson has a wonderful book on the heritage, and it's printed by the Library of Congress, and he goes over the religious life of the country during the administration of George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison particularly, and he cites all this information that's in the Library of Congress. And there's an account in there of, on a rainy day, he puts on his slicker or whatever, gets on his horse, and rides over to the Capitol for church. And, he was the President of the United States, He didn't go in a carriage or whatever. He just took himself on he liked to ride, So, any rate, the Marine band played, and there were preachers not only from the Orthodox Protestant churches, but from Quakers, Roman Catholics, Unitarians. The attendance was generally very large. The event was recognized as important in the social and religious life of the Capitol. The Reverend Manasseh Cutler, the Ohio pioneer who assisted in drafting the ordinance of 1787, that would be the Northwest Ordinance, I believe, and who was a Federalist member of Congress from 1801 to 1805, refers several times to these services in his journals and letters, frequently noting that the president was in the congregation. But January the 3rd, 1802, here's what's important. John Leland was the preacher. And John Leland, of course, as I told you, was a friend of Thomas Jefferson, so he delighted to be there and to be addressing Jefferson. He praised Jefferson, and he must have made some joke and used the text about a greater than Solomon is here, and you know how liberals are. They can't understand jokes. Jokes are not funny to liberals, and so they don't understand them. And he complains about the way he preached and the gestures he uses. Cutler maybe thought that sermons should put people to sleep. I think at the Congress when Leland spoke, nobody slept. Okay, and he was interesting, and he's told stories. But you can read the things that he wrote, and you figure out that the man was not inarticulate or stupid, and he could be very persuasive. But any rate, he was critical. But it's interesting, the Episcopalian that wrote this book down at the bottom, he says Cutler, being a strong Congregationalist and a Federalist, you see, he supported John Adams for president, not Thomas Jefferson, was naturally highly critical of John Leland, a Baptist minister and a Jeffersonian whose contribution to religious freedom was considerable. And so the report that Cutler made was influenced by his bias. Okay, that's what he's telling us there. But many others give us very favorable impressions of Leland, and some of those I put in your paper there at the end. So turning to the paper with Leland's picture on there, he was born in 1754 in Massachusetts, but I don't have any record that tells in detail about his conversion, but I do know that he had done a lot of things as a young person, that partying, as we would say today, I guess, and he didn't think God was too pleased with everything that he was involved with, and he had an experience where he felt God was speaking to him, and it caused him to start thinking. Well, eventually he actually was saved, and so he before I get into all that, I was just going to say I've got pictures on here. There is a church that's still over at Route 8 in the town of Cheshire, Massachusetts, and you can actually visit that, and that's called the First Baptist Church today. It was not the First Baptist Church back then, but the others are out of existence, so now they call this the First Baptist Church. And then I tell how to get to the cemetery, which is not far from that church on Mountain Road, and then from there you can go the opposite direction back across Route 8 and go to the Cheese Press Monument that's near the post office. And then I have the picture here of the original town of Cheshire that was called New Providence. That here's where the town of Cheshire is today. But this Stafford Hill out here, you have to go up a road out here, here it is, Stafford Hill Road, and this actually is paved down below, but then it peters out and is gravel road for a little bit there. And I've only known about, there's a monument there along that road. You have to look for just a little sign. My wife, when I took her there, she said, "That's somebody's driveway." I said, "We're going to see what's down that road." And we found the monument. I'd never seen it, never seen a picture of it before, till I'd read about it in a book, but I didn't know that much about it. I had to go out and find it on my own. Now, also there is a historic marker on Route 20 at Orange, Virginia. And that little paper called the Fellowship paper has an article in it by a friend of mine, Dr. David Brown, and it gives more details about that meeting of James Madison and John Leland at that spot. So we'll develop why they met there. By the way, what is our time limit here? We got to be done by what time? Let's see, the next session starts, let's see, I got to make sure, I got to figure out my time here a second. Let's see, 4 o'clock, so we've got to be done by 3:50. Okay, 3:50, okay. So, he moved to Virginia, he got saved up there in Massachusetts. And I can tell you that he was saved, it was again people from the Great Awakening, and there was a Baptist by the name of Shubal Stearns who eventually moved down to North Carolina, and he and some others, there was a monstrous Baptist work down there and revival down there, and then missionaries spread all over. Great things happened. But before they went south, they led some other people to the Lord, and some of those people that led to the Lord led Leland to the Lord. And so then he thought the Lord wanted him to go to Virginia, that the Lord had a great work for him to do there, and he went there as an evangelist. He also published a paper called the Virginia Chronicle, and he was in Culpeper County and Orange County, and that would be near the home of James Madison, by the way, in Orange County. And he traveled widely in evangelistic meetings. Now, in 1784, the Baptist Associations of Virginia formed a general committee, and for a united voice petitioned the legislature would originate from the general committee. Leland was the key author of many petitions the Baptists circulated and submitted to the Virginia legislature calling for complete religious liberty. 3 chief complaints: taxation to pay the Anglican clergy. This is again the establishment of religion. Requirement to register their meeting houses, and endless red tape involved. So again, they made a lot of hurdles in each different town that you had to jump over and so forth. A lot of that was left to people just being cantankerous because they didn't like the Baptists. And then the refusal to acknowledge authorities to acknowledge the validity of their marriage. So if their preachers married somebody, that it wasn't recognized. And part of this all goes back to the fact that the preachers did not have the authority of an Anglican bishop, okay, that had ordained them. And so therefore they were not recognized by the state as ministers. So if they did a wedding, then the wedding was not valid, you see. Baptists opposed the General Assessment Bill to collect taxes for teachers of religion. This was an idea that Patrick Henry came up with. The Baptists had worked to get rid of collecting taxes at all for religious groups. Well, Patrick Henry thought, well, we need religion, so we've got to fund the religion. And so he said, let's instead of just doing it for one church, let's do it for all the religious teachers. So we'll collect the money, and your money can go to whatever religious teacher that you want. You know what the Baptists said? And they were not alone. There were some other groups as well. They said, we don't want your money. Because there were always strings attached to the money. They knew that way back then. And if it was God's work, God would move his people to take care of the work. That was their attitude. We don't need to have state authority helping God's work. God doesn't need the help of man. And so James Madison sided with them and wrote a memorial and remonstrance on the religious rights of man. 1780. It's a very important statement about religious liberty written by James Manning. And it came from his interaction with these Baptists and hearing their complaints. Then, and this is a quote out of that, though the term separation of church and state was not yet in common usage, that is what Madison called for in his statement that religion should be wholly exempt from the realm of government. And so that's a quote actually from a history book by a man by the name of Macbeth. But that part, wholly exempt from this realm of government, that is a statement in Jefferson's writing. Okay? And then this was followed by Thomas Jefferson's bill for the establishing of religious freedom in 1788. But again, Madison is important. Madison and Jefferson worked together. And Jefferson was, of course, in France as our ambassador over there during this time and at the time of the writing of the federal Constitution. Jefferson did not participate in that. He wrote the Declaration and it participated in Continental Congress and all those things, but he was not around when we wrote the Constitution. But he was informed, and he was also making his suggestions, but it was all through Madison, see? And Madison was writing to him, and he was writing back to Madison, and so in 1758, it was Madison in the legislature of Virginia that pushed Jefferson's bill through. And it was supported by Madison and the Baptists and was passed by the legislature. With the sympathetic leadership of James Madison, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson, these same groups, persecuted sects such as Baptists, Presbyterians, Catholics, and Quakers, were instrumental in obtaining the repeal of the Incorporation Act. Thus, in 1787, the established church was brought to an end in Virginia. And it says, when the glebe lands were sold in 1799, thereby severing all financial ties between the Episcopal Church and the state, the work of the General Committee was complete. That's the General Committee of these Baptist Association in Virginia that had been working for religious liberty. And so that's, you see, a glebe land, if you don't understand, that was property that was owned by the town. And whoever was the minister of the standing church, in other words, the church that was the favored church of the state, he then was giving the property, these lands, as his own. Now, they didn't farm them themselves. They would hire them out to others, but they made the profits out of it. So then your Anglican members were able to live as like country gentlemen, you see, that they were like landed gentry, okay? This gave them the opportunity, and so they were participating in fox hunts and playing cards and all the other stuff that the Baptists thought was bad. I don't know if they were against fox hunts, but at any rate, they were living high on the hog at the people's expense, and they weren't really preaching the gospel, and so that was fodder for the Baptists to point out these problems. He was prominent in the revival of 1787 and 1789, and during his years in Virginia, this quote here of 3,000 sermons, actually, I think that later in his life, he numbered and estimated that he preached about 9,000 sermons. But okay, this may be down in Virginia. This was then later. He made all these tours and stuff when he moved back to Massachusetts. So this is over this period down here, just a couple years. He was preaching 3,000 sermons and baptizing 1,278 converts. So he became very well known down there. And it's that revival, if you were with me down in the other session on Isaac Backus was sent down to aid in this revival and hopefully bring the revival back up to New England. If there was something that New England could learn from the revival down there, to bring it back home to New England. And I think that at that time, Backus told Leland, because of all of his contacts with all these churches throughout the state and helping them, throughout New England, I want to say, about this church that had been established in Cheshire of Rhode Island people who were Baptists, who moved out way out in the boondocks in western Massachusetts, far enough away that the Congregational Church didn't even know they existed out there, and they could have freedom out there in the woods. Out there, actually, you could stand at that monument that I'm talking about there, that looks like a silo, basically, laid out of stone. If you go into that, it's open in the bottom, and stand on that and look out, you can look across this great forest all the way up to the top of Mountain Greylock, and you can hardly see that there's civilization there. I mean, the forest is just amazing. Of course, there's a state reservation there and stuff, and what a beautiful view that is. And so they got out there in the boondocks to have freedom out there, and so Leland joined them. He came back from Virginia and joined them. He wrote a letter to President Washington for Baptist General Committee on Religious Liberty. That was back when he was still trying to influence that we still needed a Bill of Rights. And then in 1789, and this is why I know he was fed up with slavery, he authored a resolution adopted by the Baptist General Committee. Slavery is a violent deprivation of the rights of nature and inconsistent with a republican government. He recommended that Baptists make every use of legal means to extirpate this horrid evil from the land. Now, you want to keep this in mind when you have everybody today looking back in history, not everybody, but the CRT people looking back in history and saying all these white people were racists back then. Well, let me tell you, there were people like Elijah P. Lovejoy that died in my hometown because he wasn't a racist, and they were writing as anti-slavery, and they were working for it. You know, they hated it, and this man hated it, and you'll see they hated it in Cheshire, Massachusetts, in just a moment too. So he returned to Massachusetts and settled in Cheshire, 1792. So this was after that revival, after Backus had been down there. And he was pastor of the church that was there. And the church was actually out by this monument there, that one that looks like the silo. And eventually that church went out of existence and was torn down and so forth. But he was pastor out there for a number of years. Then he left for a preaching tour in the South. Then he came back to Cheshire, and there was what's called the Great Reformation in the history books of Cheshire. Many people got saved. Leland was one of the evangelists for that. Now, 1801, the plan for the Great Cheshire Cheese. Oh, and I forgot. I got something else here. Here we go. Just a second. Yeah, I forgot I got this. Here's a book. Jefferson's Cheshire Cheese. Right there it is. And here's even a book for children. Here it is. The Big Cheese for the White House. The True Tale of a Tremendous Cheddar. And so they got this idea. It was when Jefferson was going to be inaugurated, that they would make this great cheese, and it was also a publicity stunt for Cheshire. The people in their farms and stuff, they were selling cheese, and so they were going to publicized how great their cheddar cheese was, Cheshire cheddar cheese, and they made this great big cheese and had to press it in a cider press, and somebody made a special band to go around this huge thing. Then they put it on some kind of an ox cart, took it by oxen to the Hudson River, floated it down the Hudson River to New York, put it on another boat, and then took it down to the Chesapeake and brought it back up to Washington and presented it to Jefferson. And I actually have the oh yeah, I gave you that. That's what the Great Cheshire Cheese is. This is the words on that page that they spoke to him. Now I believe Leland wrote this, but he did it on behalf of a committee. There was a whole committee of people that organized and got the families and their forms to bring all the curds, and they do all that had to be done. And but Leland accompanied this thing, and another man, and Darius Brown. Okay. And they took it down there, and this, I give you the speech that they made to the president, and then I give you the president's reply. But one of the things that they did, they praised the Constitution, and they praised Jefferson for being the president, but they also made this interesting statement. The cheese was procured by the personal labor of free-born farmers, with the voluntary and cheerful aid of their wives and daughters, without the assistance of a single slave. He loved Jefferson, but he was needling Jefferson, okay? That Virginia needed to get rid of slavery, and the country needed to get rid of slavery. And you'll notice in the text of Jefferson's reply, he doesn't touch that statement with a 10-foot pole, okay? He knew how dangerous the issue of slavery was. But on that monument, I give you the actual words on the monument, it tells us something very significant. Elder John Leland, eloquent preacher, beloved pastor, influential patriot, fathered religious liberty with James Madison, carried Virginia in the adoption of the Constitution of the United States and the First Amendment, despite opposition of every other pulpit in Massachusetts, carried every vote in Cheshire for the election of President Thomas Jefferson, and presented to him on January 1st, 1802, in the East Room of the White House, in the presence of foreign diplomats, Supreme Court judges of the Congress, the big Cheshire cheese, weighing 1,235 pounds. So, what's interesting there, John Adams, of course, was the favorite son of Massachusetts. Every town in Massachusetts in the election between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams voted for John Adams. One town voted for Thomas Jefferson, and it was Cheshire. And the reason that voted is because of the testimony of John Leland, who could tell the people there. They had never known Thomas Jefferson, but John Leland knew Thomas Jefferson, and he said, this man is the friend of the Baptists. Now there's lots of other Baptist towns, like Isaac Backus's town, Middleborough. So apparently they voted for Adams. But the Baptists were outnumbered. But in Cheshire, Massachusetts, at this time, in fact, it was still several decades later, there wasn't any other church, not because they didn't want them, not because they had anything against it, but all the people were Baptists. And gradually some more people came in, and eventually there were some other churches. But at this time, everybody went to one of like 3 Baptist churches in the town of Cheshire, if they went to church. It was all voluntarily. And so then that's how he ended up, he took the cheese down there, so the chaplain said, well, you're here anyway. We've heard all about you preaching in Virginia. Why don't you preach in Congress Sunday? So that's how he preached there. Then I tell you a note that has nothing to do necessarily with the great national history, but if you're part of the Northeast Regular Baptist Fellowship of Churches, and your church is, okay, and you know what the Fellowship of Churches, we believe in the freedom of the churches. We work together voluntarily, but we protect the sovereignty of every church, the autonomy of every church, but we are praying for each other, and in things that we can work together, we work together. And we have conferences and various things. But we have a church in that fellowship which is called the Northeast Regular Baptist Church of Millerton, New York. Henry Prowse was pastor there for more than 60 years, and I had the opportunity to work with Henry on the history of that church. And in the documents he showed me, and summary things that he had, they talked about John Leland preaching in that church. Well, I didn't have a lot of records, but later when I'm working in this Cheshire history, I find out that John Leland went to went to Dutchess County, New York for 2 years. And this is when the pastor that started the church, that came out of the Great Awakening again, had been a separate church, then became a Baptist church as they applied the scriptures and said, we've got to obey what the scriptures teach. They became a Baptist church, and it's the continuing church that's more than 250 years old is the Northeast Baptist Church of Millerton, New York. And their pastor, after 50 years, died, and the church was struggling after he died. John Leland went over there as an evangelist and preached for 2 years to help keep that church going. And another great Baptist that was in the area trained somebody, and he came over and so forth. And eventually they called a pastor. But there's a tie of John Leland, this great figure in Baptist history, with one of our churches here in New England still existing today. And he continued in evangelism the rest of his life. Now that church at First Baptist Church that I have the picture there, they claim he was their pastor all these years in later life till he died. I'm not sure that, from what I read, that he claimed to be the pastor. They might have thought he was the pastor, but he was very wanted to be independent. He felt his calling was as an evangelist. But he kept working. He served in the Massachusetts legislature. His son was in the War of 1812. And I mentioned some of the other churches that were started finally in the town. But he was out preaching in North Adams and took violently ill and died in a few days. And then they brought his body back, and they had to wait till they could to bury him. They probably put him in a vault there and then buried him after the frost was out of the ground. And I give you some of the summary statements there about Leland that others have written, that he was not some despised person as that man from Congress had reported by what others testify of him. He was the author of a book called The Rights of Conscience Inalienable. I call your attention to that. That's why I put it in this statement here. In this treatise, Leland argued 3 basic points. That the rights of conscience are inalienable, not subject to either government permission or restriction. That establishment of religion by law always damages religion, and that the real motives for establishment are not to benefit religion, but to buttress the power of civil rulers and augment the purses of ambitious clergy. That's why I talked about the clergy wanting to live like landed gentlemen, you see. Romans 14:12. Every man must give an account of himself to God, and therefore every man ought to be at liberty to serve God in a way that he can best reconcile to his conscience. Religion is a matter between God and the individuals, concluded Leland, with the religious opinions of men not being the objects of civil government, nor in any way under its control. The government has no more to do with the religious opinions of men than it has with the principles of mathematics. Let every man speak freely without fear, maintain the principles that he believes, worship according to his own faith, either one God, 3 gods, no God, or 20 gods, and let government protect him in so doing. So this is the concept of freedom of conscience. It doesn't mean that Leland didn't want people to know Jesus Christ and be saved, but he would preach that and invite them to Christ, but he was going to defend the right of others to have whatever religion they wanted, or if they didn't want to believe in Christ, they didn't have to believe in Christ. That's between them and God. And it's the principle really of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's just that simple. If I want my rights, then I have to be willing to protect other people's rights. And so, and I'm speaking of things related to conscience and beliefs and so forth. I think we come to some differences of opinions when we're talking about certain kinds of moral issues as to what is wholesome and right in society, and what we want, for instance, our children to be exposed to in the public school and so forth. If you're going to impose things upon people's children that they disagree with, then I say shut down the schools and let the people that want those kind of schools pay their schools, and we'll have our schools. But in my opinion, there is no longer a moral consensus for the public school in America, because the society has no agreement on what is moral, and therefore you Christians have a problem of sending their kids to be indoctrinated by other people who are pagans and do not have biblical moral standards. We have a serious problem, and I would not contend for people to have a right to take my children and indoctrinate them in things that I believe are opposed to what God has said in His Word. And I'm not talking about that kind of thing. Let me. I didn't share with you a great deal about. Let's see what time we got. Still got a couple minutes here. Back to the writing of the Bill of Rights. I want to go back to that. In fact, that's such an important subject. This is a Baptist history book that's got a lot of good things. I should mention, though, these people, when you get to the end of this book, you will find that they are ecumenists, and they do not support the position of we who are fundamental separatist Baptists, okay? And so keep that in mind. Also, there are certain theological discussions they get into. They do not understand a lot of biblical theology. They're historians, and so there's a lot of information here for historical, but when they get into discussions about differences in theology, it's quite apparent they do not understand the biblical theology. And they also, when it comes to modern day, they're supporting the churches that are in the Baptist churches that are in the World Council churches, the National Council churches, and all that kind of stuff. And of course, being true to the Bible, we can't go along with that, because we believe the Bible is the authoritative Word of God and inspired of God, and these people have thrown that out. And so you just can't go along with that. But at any rate, the whole first chapter, they think Leland's life working with Madison about the Bill of Rights is so important. That's where they start with. So the whole first chapter of this book is all building the background and talking about this interaction with Leland. And so they were working on getting the for the ratification of the Constitution. And Madison actually was up in New York, and he was working with John Jay and Alexander Hamilton and writing the Federalist Papers. If you're familiar with those were written to support the ratifying of the United States Constitution. Well, meanwhile, he gets letters from his own father and some other people and saying, you better come back down here to Virginia because you've got a problem in your own state. And John Leland had called a meeting of the Old Dominion Association of the Baptists, and they produced a article that says No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. And just a second. At any rate, that's not the right quote I wanted. Just a second. They passed a here. Let's see. Okay. Be it therefore enacted by the General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship place or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, constrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall suffer on account of religious beliefs or opinions, but that all men shall be free to profess by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. And so he got the Baptists together there, and they drew up a resolution that they were going to oppose the Constitution if there was no provision for freedom of religion. And so because of this, Madison got on his horse and rode back to Virginia and made appointment and went and met for hours with John Leland. And the result of that is the Baptists down there wanted Leland to run to be the ratifying or be the member from that area to stop the recognition of the Constitution by the state of Virginia, the ratification I'm trying to say. And Madison wanted to go from that area and be a supporter of the Constitution. And so Leland agreed with Madison that if he would work, that when he then would go to Congress, if they backed the Constitution, that then they would send him to Congress and he would introduce these statements that I just was reading there about religious freedom. And so that's what worked out, that Leland then told the other Baptists of what Madison was going to do, and they then backed Madison to be their representative at the ratifying convention, and Virginia did ratify the Constitution. And as I mentioned downstairs a while ago, that when he was elected then to Congress, and the first thing that he did, and in New York City, when the Congress was sitting, he introduced what we call today the Bill of Rights. And of course, that then was passed by Congress and sent to the states, and the states ratified 10 of those. And in that, it's important that religious liberty came to the forefront. It was made the first of the amendments, that the arguments of the Baptists up here in New England, down in the South as well, brought this to the attention, and it was dealt with as the first thing that we would protect religious liberty.